Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to more Conversations in the Digital Age. Hillary Clinton was hoping to win the key swing state of North Carolina, which Barack Obama carried in 2008, but narrowly lost to Mitt Romney in 2012. North Carolina has 15 electoral votes, and approximately 22.1% of North Carolina's population is black. Yet black voting declined in the presidential election by 8%. Contributing to Donald Trump's carrying the state by a slim margin of almost 4%. Did North Carolina suppress the black vote, or did blacks consciously decide not to vote for president as an ironic protest against the record of our first African-American president? Here to help us answer this question is Princeton professor Eddie S. Glaude. Professor Glaude has just written a book that will change your thinking. For sure, it changed mine, about race and politics in America. It's called Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. Eddie Glaude, we're delighted to have you with us.
It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Now, congratulations on your book, which I found so riveting. And starting with the theme of politics and race, democracy in black, African Americans were not wild about Donald Trump.
Right.
They weren't wild about Hillary Clinton either.
Right.
What does the African American community think they're going to gain from a Trump administration?
Well, I don't know so much about what the community thinks they will gain from a Trump administration. I think if we look at the data, the exit poll data, we'll see that educated African Americans voted for Hillary Clinton almost at the same levels as educated white Americans, right, in the suburbs for Clinton. But we saw something very distinctive around class, right? That the poor, working class, and the most marginal, in some ways did not turn out at the same levels of 2012, and many just stayed home. And I think that had something to do with a substantive judgment of the economic policies of the Democratic Party, and particularly over the last 8 years. Even with the symbolic significance of President Obama in the White House, the economic policies didn't fundamentally transform their life circumstances. So we saw in a place like North Carolina, given your opening, not only we saw the convergence of voter suppression and a substantive judgment on the failure of democratic policy, economic policy, and in some ways the failure of the Clinton campaign to actually appeal to the circumstances of working class people of all races, not just simply white working class folks. We saw something similar in Michigan, and we saw something similar in Wisconsin, like in Detroit, around Detroit and around Milwaukee.
Pick North Carolina because it's a state you're very much familiar with,
right,
and also because there's the irony that Trump won in North Carolina by 177,000 votes, while the incumbent Republican governor, Pat McCrory, unofficially lost to his Democratic challenger, Attorney General Roy Cooper, by 10,000 votes out of 4.7 million cast. Mm-hmm. Now, McCrory refuses to concede and is now talking about challenging the result for fraud. Right. Do you think there was fraud in the balloting in North Carolina?
Absolutely not. In some ways, I've been in consistent conversation with Reverend William Barber, who's the president of the NAACP in North Carolina. And what we saw more than anything is not kind of voter fraud, which has been the kind of red herring of Republicans over the last few election cycles. But we saw very clearly closing of particular polling sites, attempts to, in some ways, suppress the vote among black and Latino voters, having an impact on college voters, college-age voters. So I think McCrory is just trying in some significant way to undermine the democratic process in North Carolina. But what we have seen, not only in North Carolina, but in places like Texas among Latino voters, is that you saw split tickets, right? Folks voting for Trump at the top of the ticket and then voting for a different set of folks down ballot, or the other way around. So you see an electorate that's in some ways pretty dissatisfied with what was put forward, the candidates put forward. So you see only 43% or something like 43 to 46% of the electorate did not participate, did not vote at all in the election. in the presidential election. And I think that's a substantive judgment about the choices we confronted.
Were there instances where particularly African American voters did not vote for either candidate for president, but voted down ballot?
Yeah, outside of Michigan and outside of Detroit and in Flint, we saw over 90,000 ballots submitted where folks left the presidential ballot blank and voted down ballot. So this was in a battleground state like Michigan. I in my own thinking, I think that was a mistake. But we saw folks making choices, and not only did we see this among African Americans, we saw this among some Republicans, right? And so folks were just simply dissatisfied with the choices at the top of the ballot.
Now, in your book, you advocate, among other things, as a solution to various problems you perceive in society, and there are many, a form of electoral nihilism, where African American voters vote for local candidates because that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where they can have candidates who, if elected, could really help them, but will not vote for either candidate for president because they feel betrayed by both parties.
Yeah.
You think there are instances where that happened in this
Well,
election?
I don't want to attribute that kind of influence to the book, and I don't want to say that I have more influence on those voters than, say, President Obama coming to Michigan or going to Miami or the like. What I do know is this: when I wrote that in Democracy in Black, I had in mind that the choices would be Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush. And to my mind, there's no substantive difference between those two candidates in terms of their policies. But then you had Donald Trump. And Donald Trump represents to me a kind of neo-fascist turn in the United States, a kind of a legitimizing of not alt-right, but white supremacist, white nationalist sensibilities. And so what I wrote in Time magazine with a Columbia professor of political science, Fred Harris, is that black voters should strategically vote. That we had to do two things simultaneously. We had to keep Donald Trump out of office, and we had to let Hillary Clinton know that business as usual wasn't acceptable. And so the idea was that if you were in a decidedly red state or a decidedly blue state, you could vote your conscience. You could leave the ballot blank or vote down ballot. But if you were in a battleground state, like Michigan or North Carolina or the like, you should turn out in massive numbers and vote for Hillary Clinton. But I think part of what happened is that the Clinton campaign was confused. On the one hand, it tried to activate the Obama coalition. And on the other hand, it tried to do exactly what Bill Clinton did during his time. And that is to kind of triangulate, to appeal to those moderate Republicans. And so the Clinton campaign spent the majority of the summer and coming into September really going after moderate Republicans and collecting, in some ways, Bush Republican endorsements, and really assuming that the fear of Donald Trump would be sufficient to motivate its base. And what it turned out is that was just wrong. And so she didn't go to Wisconsin. She didn't take the time to register. There were over 1 million black and Latino voters, unregistered black and Latino voters in Florida. So all she needed to do was spend $25 million to get them registered. She would have won Florida. Instead, she spent over close to $1 billion on advertisements, on television ads and the like. So it was a strategic problem as well as an ideological problem.
Well, you have expressed dissatisfaction with the promise of Bill Clinton and the promise of Barack Obama, and said that at least the promise was not fulfilled as far as blacks in America are concerned. But Donald Trump, during the campaign, said, and I quote, "We have an African American president, and yet less has been done for African Americans than anybody. This is one of the worst times they've ever had." And his advisor, Steve Bannon, said, "The middle class has been shafted. Black, Hispanic, white, everybody. The political class has given them happy talk, but delivered nothing." Now, both of those statements sound like things you might have said.
It's true. It's just the wrong messenger. I think, it's certainly the case that the Trump campaign, embraced a kind of populism, but I think we need to add the adjective authoritarian populism that we saw on the left with Bernie Sanders' campaign. Because what we do know is that the fundamentals of the economic philosophy that has in some ways governed this country over the last few decades, the contradictions that are evident in our form of life, have made it such that people who are working hard, who are playing by the rules, who are busting their behinds every single day, are falling behind. They can't imagine a brighter future for their children. And this is particularly the case, right, among black and brown folk in this country. And so when Donald Trump made the claim, right, because I said in Democracy in Black that Barack Obama is a Melvillian confidence man selling the snake oil of hope and change. And of course, Clinton is from a place called Hope. And what we saw, Glass-Steagall was passed under the Democrats, welfare reform under the Democrats, crime bill under the Democrats, right? In all of the ways, in so many ways.
Well, Glass-Steagall was repealed under the Democrats.
Repealed under the Democrats, right? In all of the ways that we can begin to measure, right, the Democratic Party, since the ascendance of the Democratic Leadership Council, has in some ways left behind the most vulnerable, the most marginal, working class people in this country. And so part of what I was suggesting in this book is that, black voters who are often taken for granted were a captured electorate. We needed to strike back. We needed to figure out how to act and behave, right, and participate in this political process in a very different way. But Trump can't be the messenger of that because Trump doesn't give a damn about black or brown people.
Well, certainly one of the traditional goals of minority groups has been power sharing, to have some of their guys in office who will be better disposed to their point of view, or just symbolically. So you say that high office is not unavailable to this group or that group. So we've tried, our political leaders have tried to construct tickets that were balanced, to have representatives of various groups. I mean, look at the Supreme Court. Right. Even identity politics has been the order of the day. So I ask you, here you had the historic election of Barack Obama to 2 terms. First African-American to be elected as leader of the free world, as President of the United States. He appoints 2 African-American attorneys general. He appoints Susan Rice first as ambassador to the United Nations and then as national security advisor. His consigliere, as opposed to Steve Bannon, Trump's consigliere, is Valerie Jarrett, right, another African American. Right. So you must have thought that you accomplished a great deal when Barack Obama took office.
No, not really. Symbolically it was significant. For my son, who's a junior at Brown, he came of age politically with a black family in the White House. But he also came of age with Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, Rekia Boyd, Eric Garner, and I can go on and on and on. Philando Castile, right? Alton Sterling, Ayanna Stanley Jones. We can keep going on and on and on. So he's come of age in a moment of viral death. He's come of age in a moment in which 240,000 homes were lost in the collapse of the housing market, and many of those folks whose wealth was in some significant way located in their homes still find themselves struggling, still find themselves living in homes that are barely above water, struggling oftentimes in a brutal rental market, New York City, right? So there's been the symbolic significance of President Obama, and we have to acknowledge that. But the idea of just having, brown and black faces in high places, as if that's going to transform the circumstances of everyday ordinary people, I think that's a pipe dream. And we have to begin to look at the politics of the folks who are in these positions. There's a presumption, and it's a presumption that we ought to hold, that people who come from our community should be open to the circumstances and the feelings and aspirations of our communities. That seems to me a reasonable assumption, whether you're from Little Italy or Little Cuba, or you're from black communities. But it doesn't follow from that assumption that there will be concrete policies that will transform the life circumstances of black folk. So as soon as Barack Obama was elected, he had to declare that he was the president of all America. And so you had a constituency that voted for him at 93, 95%. And we didn't care if he was the president of all America. We just cared that we had voted for you at that level, and we needed something to be delivered in order to transform the circumstances of our communities. But what we do know in this country is that the more that a policy position is supported by African American constituencies, the more likely that policy position will fail to pass. Because it has something to do with how deeply overdetermined this country is by the value gap, by the belief that certain people, white people, are valued more than others. And so whether you have black people in high places or not, until we uproot that, we will find ourselves on the hamster wheel.
Well, black leaders did approach President Obama to enlist his support for various policies that they championed. And his answer was, I'm not a black president, I'm president of all the people. In substance, he said that, isn't that right?
Yeah, and could you imagine him saying that to the LGBTQI community? Could you imagine him saying that to women activists who were pushing for the passage of the Lilly Ledbetter bill? In other words, black folk are this captured electorate. They are, according to my colleague Paul Freimer, right? That is, Democrats take us for granted. Their only role, their only position or orientation to us is to deliver us to the polls every 2-4 years with no intention on delivering policy because they understand that we have no place else to go. And so African Americans who are rational actors in this political process see that the Republican Party has really no interest and they're full of these rabid racists, and the Democratic Party knows we have nowhere to go. So we vote for the lesser of two evils in some ways. And so you get this moment with President Obama when folk were like, can there be an agenda to address the jobs crisis in black communities? Can there be specific policy initiatives to address the racialized dimension of the housing crisis?
The incarcerated society.
And so it was only with Black Lives Matter that he began to, with the push in the streets, that he began to tackle criminal justice. And so all of this reveals that we can't just simply assume by having black people and black faces in high places that it's going to transform the circumstances of the most vulnerable in our communities. We need a much more grassroots, organized politics that will reflect the interest of the working poor and the poor in our community. That's what we need.
Well, many political observers have said with the election of Obama, we became post-racial. We'd made so much progress that, and perhaps with Black Lives Matter, there was a retrenchment of that position. But you look at the Supreme Court on voting rights, their analysis in the Shelby County case, which included Clarence Thomas in the majority, in the 5-4 majority. They said we made so much progress in the South on voting rights that it's unconstitutional to have bad actor states, even though Congress said that there were. And
what did we see immediately after?
And what did we see immediately afterwards?
Voter ID laws in North Carolina, draconian laws in Texas, right?
Well, of course, they corrected the voter ID law, I guess, in July or August of before the election. But was that too little, too late?
It was too little, too late, in my opinion. And part of what I argue in the book is that at the heart of this country is what I call the value gap. And the value gap is the belief that white people matter more than others. And that belief animates our social practices, our political and economic arrangements. And it's evidenced in what the political theorist John Rawls calls, it's evidenced in our basic structure, right, in our institutions. And so what we see is that at every moment of advance, every moment of an attempt in which we try to overcome the contradictions in our society, there's a reassertion of the value gap that limits it. So we have the articulation of the principles of freedom, liberty, and equality. We reconcile those principles with racial slavery, the value gap. We have radical reconstruction, attempt at multiracial democracy. What do we have in response? Convict leasing, Jim and Jane Crow. The value gap reasserts itself. We have the mass mobilization of everyday ordinary people in the civil rights movement in the mid-20th century. What do we get in response? The call for law and order, the tax revolt in California, reassertion of the value gap. We get the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president. What do we get in response? The vitriol of the Tea Party, attack on voting rights, the value gap. So, and what do we get in response to 8 years of Obama? Donald Trump, right? Well, and so this is just this reassertion. This is this kind of repeated minstrel show that we can't get out of.
Well, but it's almost the observation of a kind of Hegelian dialectic where you make progress as one step forward and 2 steps back. But what's the answer? I mean, how do you break out of that?
Well, I think we need a revolution of value. We need to change what we mean by, we need to change our demands of government. We need to change our understanding of black people, and we need to change what ultimately matters to us. And that revolution of value is going to require strategy in the streets, a strategy at the ballot box, and a strategy in the courtroom, your wheelhouse, right? And I think, so we need a fundamental reawakening of the demos. And we saw some of that in the Bernie Sanders campaign, but we also saw some of it in the populism of Donald Trump. And the question is, will we go with the kind of left populism of Bernie Sanders or the authoritarian populism of Trump? We see where we are now, but what I do know is this, is that everyday ordinary people are reimagining politics at the local level. They're going to challenge and change the direction of this country, and that's going to require us to really look the ugliness of who we are squarely in the face. to confront our fears and to confront this idea, because it's a dying idea, that this is a white nation. It's no longer that. It will never be that. That's dead. It's gone.
White nation is gone. Well, that's very interesting. Was it gone in North Carolina? You were part of a march called Forward Together. And I think you mentioned the charismatic speaker, Reverend Barber, who spoke there. Now, voting rights not the only issue in North Carolina, was it?
No.
So why don't you talk about some of the things that prompted you to march?
So North Carolina is ground zero, right? After the election of Barack Obama, the Koch brothers really funneled a lot of funds into the state.
Is that why he lost in 2012 in that state? Well,
it had everything to do with precisely the ways in which Republican interest and financial interests decided to use the state of North Carolina as a test case. Reverend Barber is fond of saying, we don't need to ask what a Trump presidency will look like. We've already seen it in North Carolina with Governor McCrory. And what happened? We saw increasing efforts to underfund public education as they moved public dollars into private hands. We saw a wholesale attack on public health care. We saw a wholesale attack on teachers' unions. We saw a wholesale attack on undocumented workers. We saw attack on women's rights. So we saw across the board in North Carolina, the extremists on the right try to implement policy that devastated everyday ordinary workers. And what Forward Together and what Reverend Barber and NAACP did, which is really an example for the kind of coalitional politics we need in this moment, is that they cut across racial lines. They cut across seeming self-interest and built coalitions that went from the eastern part of North Carolina to the Research Triangle, where you had folks who were black, brown, yellow, folks who were undocumented, folks who were LGBTQI, to folks who were just simply union folk, folks who just wanted a hospital in their communities. That hospital was closed because the North Carolina governor refused to accept federal dollars with regards to Obamacare, And he created that coalition, and I saw the largest mass mobilization of people in the South since Selma, and it wasn't a movement predicated upon the suppression of race. It was a movement in which racial discord, racial animus, was at the center of a broader justice and morally driven movement. So I invoke the Forward Together movement as one example of the kind of grassroots democratic politics we need to challenge this extremist turn, this authoritarian turn that we're seeing in the country today.
So, and that march in North Carolina involved both blacks and whites and
Latinos, LGBTQ, union, undocumented.
And women, because the North Carolina laws make it place burdens on women seeking abortion. They need a sonogram and counseling and all the rest. That'll be tested in court, I'm sure.
And what we saw was, everyday ordinary people who thought of themselves in relation with other people who hold similar interests, who face certain similar problems, where the stuff that connect us was more important than the stuff that divided us, And that's a rhetoric that we hear from the White House with Obama, but it's a rhetoric that wasn't in support of business as usual, where Wall Street benefits and Main Street suffers, It was a view of what connects us in light of a broader and more robust idea of the public good that is in, I think, a better stead with our ideals of democracy.
Okay, so to borrow a phrase from Dr. King, where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here? I think we go to a radical politics. We go to a radical vision. One of the most insidious dimensions of our contemporary moment, Jim, is that there's a wholesale attack on our imaginations. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, I'm paraphrasing him, that God speaks to us through our imaginations. And I always ask my students at Princeton, if that's true, then what is the devil doing? And so part of what the moment is all about is to convince us that our only options are those right in front of us. And part of what radical imagination is all about is to begin to see possibility beyond the limitations of now. And so we do that in radical politics with others who are similarly situated.
And you do that on the streets, in the courtroom, and at the ballot box with electoral nihilism.
Not necessarily electoral nihilism, but with electoral imagination.
Electoral imagination. So I have a question for you, Professor Eddie Glaude. do you see more democracy? Are we making progress?
Absolutely not. My colleagues.
So you're not optimistic?
It's a hope that's not hopeless but unhopeful, to quote Du Bois.
So you have to keep working.
It's a blues silk hope.
Eddie Glaude, thank you so much for coming by.
I appreciate you.
And thank you for coming by. Great, great book.
Thank you so much.
And tune in next week for more Conversations in the Digital Age. For Conversations in the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.